Christianity Comes to the Queen's Bush by Norman Seabrook. We will attempt to live up to your expectations. Preparing Christianity Comes to the Queen's Bush was a challenge. To accommodate the necessary time frame, we left out more than we included. I thank the Historical Society for the opportunity to make this presentation at this time. To grasp the importance of what took place back then, we focused on one denomination, one person, and his family. He was the first ambassador for Christ at the time of settlement here in North Grey. The work and dedication of others is acknowledged with great respect. Our story is like the skipping stone on the water, touching down here and there on the way to its destination. I thank my daughter, Mary Seabrook Russell, and my grandson, Randy Seabrook, for their patience and perseverance, without which we would have not met our deadline. The success of any presentation depends on the narrator's ability to convey the information to the audience. I wish to dedicate this presentation to the memory of that Wesleyan Methodist saddlebag minister, Reverend John Neilands. Your narrator today will be his great-great-great-nephew, Edward C. Neilands, a local retired teacher, presently a farmer, church organist, and when opportunity knocks, a politician. Christianity comes to the Queen's Bush, pre-church worship. The pioneers did not just get up one morning and decide to build churches. It took 20 to 30 years to get to the church construction. Perhaps we should refer back to the early 17th century, when some of the Jesuit priests passed this way. Reports about their travels are the early history of this area. In the year 1600, there were approximately 30,000 natives in the Huronia region. The Indians and the French. At the turn of the 17th century, New France expanded its horizons, sending explorers to the Great Lakes region, also called the Upper Country, or in French, Pays d'en haut, in search of furs and passage to the west. Samuel de Champlain and Étienne Brulé were two such Frenchmen who explored the Great Lakes region and formed alliances with some of its residents. In 1608, Champlain founded Quebec City, and in 1610, Brulé, his right-hand man, set out to discover the West and wintered in the Ottawa River Valley. He stayed in Huronia in 1611 and became the first European to see the Great Lakes. In 1615, thanks to a strong relationship between the French and the Wendats, whom the French called Huron, the first mission was established on Ontarian soil. On August 12, 1615, Recollet missionary Joseph Le Caron celebrated the first Mass at Caraouga, near the present-day village of La Fontaine. In 1649, after coexisting for more than 30 years with the French, the Huron nation was attacked by the Iroquois at the Ste. Marie Mission, now known as Midland. Two priests, Jean de Brébeuf and Gabriel Lallemand, were tortured to death. The attack did not only affect men of the cloth. The French's Aboriginal allies were also targeted. Forced to leave the Great Lakes region, they made their way to Quebec City, where their descendants remain to this day. From the western shores of the Penetang Peninsula, Champlain could look across the waters of Nottawasaga Bay to where the massive outline of the Blue Mountains showed like a barrier against the setting sun. In the shadow of that mountain, Champlain lay the villages of the Tobacco Indians, and he determined to visit them. A Catholic religious order was established in 1540, known as the Society of Jesus, later called Jesuits. Their mission statement was to strive for spiritual perfection for themselves and all men. We should note the instigator of this order was a soldier who had spent many years acquiring an education and then became a priest. The French Jesuits established themselves in Quebec in 1632 during Champlain's time. By 1639, they had established an outpost, fort, at the mouth of the River Wye near Midland. This outpost was known as Sainte Marie among the Hurons. These Jesuit priests worked throughout this vast area from 1639 to 1649, converting the natives to Christianity. Their reports and records of what they did and saw is the basis for our historical records of these early times. This 10-year period would require volumes to cover properly, but what took place was part of the British-French wars that were ongoing those many years in Europe. After dispersing the Hurons, the Iroquois then turned to the Tobacco Indians and the Eries, and in 25 years completely wiped out these tribes. The Martyrs' Shrine and reconstructed outpost at Midland stand as a memorial to their sacrifices. Note, Norman Seabrook worked briefly on the rebuilding of Fort Ste. Marie in 1963. On the maps of the ensuing century, the former Huron country is designated merely the beaver hunting grounds of the Iroquois. Previous to 1649, north of the St. Lawrence River and the Great Lakes, the French and Hurons were engaged in the fur trade, while on the south side of the river were the British and Iroquois. The battle between these two factions was ongoing for over 100 years, culminating in September 1759 on the Plains of Abraham in Quebec City. The English general James Wolfe and the French Louis-Joseph Marquis de Montcalm both were wounded and died as a result of this battle. In 1793, the French officially ceded what was known as New France to the British. Last big battle in Ontario. What is believed the last Indian war of any extent in this district, perhaps in all Ontario, occurred between 1712 and 1715. It involved Indians of the entire area, from the Blue Mountain to the Saugeen, with Indians of the Owen Sound, the Beaver, and Meaford areas included. It is possible warriors from Lake Superior and Manitoulin Island were also involved. In that battle, the Ottawas fought the Mohawks of the Five Nations for the third and final time in the same area, inflicting a terrible defeat on them. Only 6 Mohawks were allowed to survive. They were given the task of carrying a grim warning to the Iroquois leaders in the south, never to return to the land of the Ottawas again. The battle occurred early one June morning at the foot of the Blue Mountain. Twice the Iroquois had returned to the land, trying to retain the area which they had once held. following the period in which the Jesuits were martyred in the Midland area. And twice the Iroquois had been repulsed by Sagami and his warriors, though not decisively. This time the defenders were to have horrible revenge for all the terrible defeats of the past, including the 1647-49 massacre of the Hurons, the Petons, and the French. One of the martyred priests had met his death not many miles from the site of this battle at the mission of Saint-Matthieu. Soon after the Blue Mountain battle, the Five Nations crossed the border to the south, never to return to Canada until after the American Revolutionary War. Introduction, Treaties and Surveys. When the 1818 treaty was signed acquiring land east of the center line, St. Vincent, Euphrasia, etc., Chief Newash and his small tribe had a village near the Owen Sound Harbor in the area we know as Brook in Sarawak Township. In 1834, the Wisconsin Agreement resulted in about 1,100 natives returning to Ontario. These natives dispersed to join various Indian tribes. Approximately 150 joined Chief Newash's band. When survey and settlement of Grey County took place, Chief Newash and his band were the only known native residents in this area, Grey North, at the time. We understand that this band hunted deer in what is now Southgate Township, picked blueberries up around Tobermory, and their tobacco, corn, etc. were grown near the Huron shores. They fished and hunted throughout the area. We would have called them nomads. Survey and settlement. In 1791, Canada was divided into the two provinces of Upper and Lower Canada. The significance of Lake Huron as the western boundary of Upper Canada was recognized, and communication with its vast extent had been established by way of Lake Simcoe and Georgian Bay, as well as Lake St. Clair. Of the lands that lay between Burlington Bay and Lake Huron, vast areas remained unknown till after 1820. The northern part of this area became known as the Queen's Bush. What is known as the center line from Burlington Bay north may be traced today, forming the boundary between the townships of West Luther, Proton, Artemisia, Euphrasia, and St. Vincent on the east, and Arthur, Egremont, Glenelg, Holland, and Sydenham on the west. According to present-day maps, this boundary lies on a course about 9 degrees to the west of true north. The line divides the county of Grey into two nearly equal parts. In 1798, all that constitutes the present county of Grey was Indian land. 20 years later, on October 17, 1818, the Deputy Superintendent General of Indian Affairs, William Close, met with the chiefs and principal men of the Chippewa tribe of Indians in the township of King, and entered into an agreement for the purchase of a tract which lay in the county of Simcoe on the east side of the due north line. This was signed by Meskwaki, or Yellowhead, a chief of the Reindeer tribe, Kakaketchum, chief of the Catfish tribe, Muskegongsi, chief of the Otter tribe, Manitonabi, chief of the Pike tribe, and Manitomaubanids on behalf of the Chippewa Nation of Indians inhabiting the northern part of the unpurchased portion of the home district, Toronto. The part of the London district that lay on the westerly side of the due north line remained Saugeen territory until 1836. On August 9th of that year, the Lieutenant Governor, Sir Francis Bond Head, met on Manitoulin Island with the chiefs of the Ottawas, Chippewas, and Saugeens, and obtained the consent of the Ottawas and Chippewas to his proposal. It is apparent that this treaty, the Soaking Treaty, took in the land in the county of Grey from the west of the townships of Artemisia, Euphrasia, and St. Vincent to a line directly west of Owen Sound, and extending south from that line probably over all the remainder of the county, or in any case until it reached the purchased parts of the London district. Thus, the white man had acquired all of the county, with the exception of the territory which is now the township of Keppel and Sarawak. In 1852, Grey became a provisional county. By 1854, a courthouse had been built, provincial conditions met, and Grey became an acknowledged county. Subsequent boundary changes resulted in the 16 townships that we know as being Grey County. During his survey of the townships of Collingwood and St. Vincent in 1833, Rankin made his home in a log house built at Laura Bay, and so it is said he was the first settler in the township of Collingwood, formerly Alta. Though the township of St. Vincent was surveyed in the same year, 1833, as the township of Collingwood, the early settlement of St. Vincent proceeded more slowly than its sister township. Euphrasia Township was surveyed by Rankin in 1836, but no letter of instructions addressed to the surveyor has been found. On the 21st of September in that same year, Rankin submitted his completed survey report. The greater part of the land granted went into the hands of Canada Company, and was, at least in part, compensation for lands that the company had surrendered elsewhere. There were, in fact, in Euphrasia, no grants at all to Loyalists or to sons and daughters of Loyalists, and no grants at all to military or militia claimants. Apart from 12 grants, none of which was in excess of 200 acres, the entire township was divided between grants to the Canada Company and grants to individual purchasers of Crown lands. Rankin commenced his survey of the new township of Sydenham in September 22nd and finished November 30th, 1840. Unlike Collingwood, St. Vincent, and Euphrasia, the township of Sydenham was, from the beginning, an intrinsic part of the Owen Sound settlement. The township of Derby had its beginnings in common with those of Sydenham in the laying out of Garifraxa Road, with 50-acre free grant lots on each side, those on the east side of the road being in the township of Sydenham, and those on the west side in the township of Derby. The instructions of July 8, 1840, from the Surveyor General to Charles Rankin, called for the survey of a tract in the vicinity of Owen Sound. Some years later, in 1853, this survey of Sullivan was completed, gathered from information from a history, County of Grey, 1931. The beginnings of settlement in the townships of Sullivan and Holland consisted of the occupation by free grant settlers of the 50-acre lots fronting on the Owen Sound Road that had been laid out by John MacDonald in 1840-41. In April 1843, the Commissioner of Crown Lands authorized the survey of Sullivan Township on the Owen Sound Road. The report of his survey of Sullivan was submitted by Mr. Dennis on October 20th, 1843. John MacDonald completed his survey of the road, Garifraxer Road, today Highway 6, in 1841, which comprised Concession 1 of the township that later became Sullivan, and Concession 1 of the township that later became Holland Township. Rankin, on completion of his survey, made his report to the Commissioner of Crown Lands in 1849-50. In 1848-49, Charles Rankin laid out the Toronto-Sydenham Road, now number 10 highway, passing through Artemisia from its southeast to its northwest corner. Artemisia Township was surveyed in 1849 by Rankin. Settlement of these townships followed shortly after the survey. The Wesleyan Methodist Saddlebag minister, Reverend John Nealons, was the first minister sent to the new settlement of Owen Sound in 1841. Nealons was a dedicated follower of John Wesley. John Wesley, 1703 to 1791, founded the Methodist movement, initially an offshoot of the Church of England, which grew into a major church in its own right. In doing so, Wesley brought about the greatest religious revival of the 18th century. The name Methodism derives from the methodical approach Wesley adopted from the Bible for developing personal devotion. His decision to employ lame preachers and preach outdoor sermons on the Word of God to a mainly working-class population angered the Church of England. It led to a split, and in 1795, after John Wesley's death, the Methodist Church was established. Wesley traveled over 250,000 miles across Britain, mainly on horseback, preaching over 40,000 sermons during his lifetime, often facing fierce opposition and persecution. He also spent 2 years in Georgia, USA, and was an author and publisher of much religious material. His work and preaching were known to every branch of society. During John Wesley's lifetime, he is attributed to have written over 2,000 letters. He was also responsible for writing or editing at least 390 publications, including some in Hebrew, Greek, French, and English, and books on medicine as well as religious works. On March 2nd, 1791, he slipped peacefully away at nearly 88 years of age, thus ending the life of the first Wesleyan Methodist saddlebag minister. Following the American Revolutionary War, 1775 to 1784, the Methodists were to become the largest of the many religious denominations in the new republic. The Methodist expansion in what eventually became the Dominion of Canada was not as dynamic. Yet, by 1884, the Methodist Church was Canada's largest Protestant denomination. Prince Edward County, 1788. In 1788, a pious young man called Lyons came to Canada and engaged in teaching school in Adolphustown. Having a zeal for the Lord and seeing ignorance and sin abounding, he collected the people together on Sabbath days in different neighborhoods and sang and prayed and exhorted the people to flee from the wrath to come. Lyons probably didn't know it, but he started something in the Bay of Quinte that within a generation was to become the strongest Protestant denomination in Canada. Certainly today, its lineal descendant, the United Church, is the most dominant and had the most lasting influence on the life of Prince Edward County. This influence was great enough to supplant whiskey, to elbow out the established church, which was granted 1/7 of all the land in Upper Canada, and gave Prince Edward County place names a biblical flavor unlike any other county in the province. Bethel, Jericho, Gilead, Bethesda, Carmel, Sodom, and Gomorrah. By any odds, the Church of England should have won a predominant place in the hearts of the settlers of Prince Edward. But through snobbishness, indifference, lack of good men, the established church never did establish itself in the county, not in the emotions and makeup of the hard-working men and women who settled the land and tilled it. The Church of England did make a place for itself with the merchant and professional classes, but it was a small place of little influence and less importance. Freeborn Garrison and Democratization of Canada. See Reverend Ken Barker's article dated August 15th, 2008. One of the religious leaders who played a role in these developments, both north and south of the border, was Freeborn Garrison, an energetic Methodist circuit rider who was born to an affluent family in Hartford County on this date in 1752. In 1775, on the eve of the American Revolution, young Garrison was converted under the preaching of Francis Ashbury, who had come to America in October 1771 to serve as a Methodist circuit riding missionary. Garrison joined the Methodists, freed his slaves, and became a traveling preacher. The first designated minister to the Owen Sound area at the time of settlement was Reverend John Nealons. My introduction to this saddlebag minister took place about 1953, when my father-in-law, Jack Nealons of Massey, Grey County, Ontario, loaned me the Nealons family history to read. Since then, in researching or reading other historical materials, this minister's name kept resurfacing. Number one, who was Reverend John Nealons, and where did he come from? Number two, what did this traveling minister do? And number three, what were the consequences of his work? This brief presentation attempts to answer at least some part of these questions. Any effort by me or others to provide a detailed account of his extensive activities requires more time and space. The Nealons History, 1225 to 1931, was compiled in 1931 by Louis Nealons of Toronto, Ontario. He relied on Nealons, K-N-E-E-L-A-N-D-S, genealogy, written 1897 by Brigadier General S.F. Nealons, LLD, who had previously compiled a genealogical history which is in New York City. Louis Nealons claimed to be the 17th generation since the time of Robert the Bruce. The earliest recorded Nealand birth record can be traced back to AD 1225. James Nealand, as son of the parson of Gowrie, was the first cousin of Sir William Wallace. He was a military man who so distinguished himself at the Battle of Bannockburn that King Robert Bruce granted him an estate in Lanarkshire, which remained in the family for 400 years. When Mary, Queen of Scots, reigned, Major William Nealons was a loyal supporter. This was in the time of John Knox. At that time, the Nealons family was split, with some remaining loyal to the Catholic Queen, while others became followers of John Knox. Those who remained loyal to Mary, Queen of Scots, used the name Clelands thereafter. At that time, Mary, Queen of Scots issued a coat of arms to this family. After 1630, the Nealons and Cleland's families began their migration from Scotland. John and Edward to the USA, grandsons of Major William Nealance, U.S. branch 1630s. Others went from Scotland to Ireland. The body of Abraham Nealance is to be found in Cemetery Castledurg. This was the first Nealance to settle in Ireland. He was also the fourth generation from Major William Nealance. This branch were followers of John Knox, Presbyterians. These Nealance lived in Ireland at the time of the Battle of the Boyne. Political, religious turmoil prevailed at that time, indeed in some degree continues to this day. About 100 years later, John Wesley conducted missions in Ireland. The Nealans were attracted to and became adherents to the Wesleyan Methodist movement. As we know, the Church of England came into existence when Henry VIII fell out with the Roman Catholic Pope over the denial of a divorce Henry felt he was entitled to. Consequently, Henry replaced the Pope in the new Catholic Church of England. Religious divisions seem to have been ongoing throughout history and continue today. This division caused problems in Canada, which we will relate to a little later. After another 100 years of religious and political turmoil, many Irish immigrated to the New World. John Nealance was born in the county of Tyrone in 1779. He was a farmer and a preacher when called upon. In 1810, he married a lady by the name of Todd. In 1817, after her death, he and a brother Joseph and a son William sailed to America, landing in New York. They lived for a time in New York State, but they were loyal to the British Crown. Life was not pleasant. Their American neighbors had not forgotten the Revolution or the War of 1812. They eventually moved up to Peel County, Ontario, in 1819. They acquired farmland on the southeast corner of Steeles and Huronia Street, Highway 10. When arriving in Upper Canada, they expected freedom, religious freedom in particular. However, the family compact ruled at that time. The Church of England was the designated church. A few Presbyterian ministers were accepted, but Methodists were not permitted to marry. The following notes by Reverend Ken Barker explain the situation well. In 1792, Jacob Mountain was appointed the first Anglican bishop. Mountain was a capable administrator, but he had his prejudices. He approved of the few Presbyterian and Lutheran clergy he met, presumably because their academic standards were the match of Anglican clergy. But he was not impressed by the Methodist preachers, a set of ignorant enthusiasts whose preaching is calculated only to perplex the understanding and corrupt the morals, to relax the nerves of industry and dissolve the bands of society. John Wesley aimed to provide preaching and fellowship, a new religion of the heart within the Church of England, not to establish a separate church. Many Anglican clergymen, though, opposed him, disapproving of his evangelistic methods. Barred from church pulpits, Wesley preached in houses, barns, fields, wherever he could find an audience. Methodism attracted great support among common people and the poor, and later across the Atlantic in North America. In its American form, Methodism expanded quickly as a denomination marked by easy-to-understand and highly emotional services. The Methodist Episcopal Church imposed no educational requirements for its circuit riders. The candidate for ordination simply proved before a committee that he had read and understood a set of prescribed books. In the absence of colleges and theological schools, the early laborers taught each other Wesley's teachings from his sermons, which they carried in their saddlebags. The preachers lived on a pittance, determined as they were to save the souls of others. The following is taken from St. Vincent Township History Book, 1847 to 1967, in the chapter Churches of St. Vincent. Building a home for themselves, a shelter for the cow and perhaps an ox, a place to worship, and a school, these were the labors to which the settlers turned as soon as a clearing was made. St. Vincent Township was one area where a place to worship God held a foremost place in the hearts of the pioneers. At first, services were often held in the homes, the snug cabins where family and neighbors knelt and prayed together and listened while some devout, earnest man spoke to them. Just when the first of such services was held is not known for certain, but there is little doubt that the Reverend John Nealons, a traveling preacher of the Wesleyan Methodists, officiated at the first of these services. It is recorded that he performed the marriage ceremony of Robert Mitchell and Susan Kroll in 1841. The first known appointment to the Owen Sound Grey County area was the Wesley Methodist saddlebag minister Reverend John Nealons. The explanation of his appointment is in the following letter. Reverend John Nealons' letter to the Christian Guardian, Owen Sound in St. Vincent, December 20th, 1841. To the editor of the Christian Guardian, Reverend and dear sirs, as I am convinced that you are always gratified to hear of our beloved Zion, perhaps a few lines from the Owen Sound and St. Vincent mission may be acceptable. As you know, I was appointed to the Barrie Mission last conference with my respected brother, the Reverend Thomas McMullen, and having received instructions to proceed to the Owen Sound mission in October, I have moved about 80 miles through the forest in less than 1 year from that time, and the task of moving now to the Sound, which is about 70 miles from where I was located in the township of Sunnydale, seemed something of a trial of the flesh. Going by water was now dangerous and uncertain, and by land the roads were nearly impassable. But on considering the situation of the Indians, and also the white inhabitants of St. Vincent, and my duty to submit to the judgment of my seniors in the office in the church, I willingly used every effort to get to my place of destination. So I engaged a friend with a light boat to sail or row near the shore for safety, and I traveled by land with my pony through deep mud and creeks swollen with water, which is generally the case at this late season of the year. The boat took my wife, one bed and covering, with some wearing apparel. Part of our necessities for housekeeping were broken before we got to Sunnydale, some lost, some forgotten, and some left behind. We traveled 40 miles by water and upwards of 50 by land to St. Vincent, where we are located at present. On arriving here, I learned that the Indians, with a few exceptions, had gone to their hunting ground, but I had no rest until I found a boat going to the Sound. After much danger and lodging one night in the woods, we got safe to the Indian improvement, where I found accommodation in the brothers Newash's wigwam. We had a religious meeting with the few that were present. I learned here that the Indians are expected to return to their place of locations, some sooner and other later during the winter. The interpreter has yet to come. As the season is so far advanced, going by the water from this place is nearly impractical, and there is only a footpath by the land, and part of that way swampy. So, Except it may be passable during the freezing season, I cannot get by land, but we have hopes that a road will be made, possibly in the spring, so that there may be access to the Indian settlement by the land from this place. I have made arrangements to go there when the Indians return. An interpreter can be obtained. I have formed an acquaintance with some of the white settlers recently I located on the road leading from Owen Sound to Oakville, and have made arrangements to preach among them. The friends in St. Vincent and elsewhere are very friendly, and we have one small class formed, with hopes of a second. The people are willing to hear. There seems to be a yielding to the word, and a tender feeling pervades our congregations. I hope some good will result from the weak exertions made here. I visited most of the small settlements in the township, and the people are desirous to hear. I hope the missionary board will consider the Indians at the Sound, the settlers on the new road, and the inhabitants of St. Vincent as places which call loudly for help. I suppose Brother John Ryerson has stated to the board the necessity of having a place erected for the preacher to live in, and a schoolhouse in the Indian settlement. While considering the expense of the above mission, I have been led to consider the praiseworthy conduct of our missionary friends in the past year, who came forward so nobly in a case of emergency in support of this good cause. I have faith to believe that the poor wandering Indians of the forest and the destitute white man who has left his fatherland to seek a home in the Canadian fertile soil shall not lift up their voices nor stretch out their hands in vain, but that those who have been benefactors to the suffering will come forward and pour out their prayers and the means with their sympathies into the treasury of the Lord, and will show themselves more and more the friends of the poor. I return thanks in the name of the inhabitants of this remote region for the insertion of the municipal and school acts in your well-conducted and valuable journal. Pray for us. Believe me, your affectionate and sincere friend, signed, John Nealons. Reverend John Nealons was 62 years old at this time. Reverend Nealons' letter is a condensed account of his life as a saddlebag minister. His dedication to John Wesley's method of delivering the gospel to the common people is evident. Today, the Methodist way of preaching has spread to almost every country in the world. Prior to his appointment to Owen Sound, Reverend John Nealons journeyed from Churchville north to the Queen's Bush, beginning sometime in the 1830s. There were no roads. Indeed, some of the townships were not surveyed at that time. Churchville in 1819 was a promising community in that area. Brampton was not surveyed until 1834. To the Wesleyans, or as they were later known, the Canada Methodist Church, belongs the honor of establishing the first organized congregation in the township. This was in 1843, when the hardy folk who had taken up land in the Irish Mountain area, ably assisted by others in various sections of the township, succeeded in having Reverend John Nealons make his home in the community. Following his tenure in Owen Sound, he was away on his missionary journeys much of the time, but did make his abode in a log cabin at the foot of the mountain. The services were held in the Long family home on Lot 24, Concession 8. As settlement progressed in other parts of the township, services were being held in many places by those zealous followers of the Methodism, known as lay preachers. Included in these, Nathan Duxbury, 7th Line class leader, Mount Pleasant Church, Duxbury Cemetery, Mount Zion, class leader Jason Burchell. He lived on the 9th Line North, journeyed nearly every Sunday to the district south of Greersville. He did much to establish the Second Wesleyan congregation. The original Mount Zion Church opened May 28, 1853. The brick church, built in 1863, still stands as a private residence. These congregations of Mount Pleasant and Mount Zion were apparently the only two Methodist congregations organized until 1855, when a third was established in the village of Meaford. Bethesda's class, White's class leader James Bowes and Richard Taylor, Ebenezer's class leader Richard Sparling, Cook's class, Temple Hill and Rockland, class leader John Cook, Walters Falls class leader Henry Smith, Harkaway's class leader Lyons, Sydenham's class, Bogner and St. Paul's, class leader Thomas Abra, Woodford's class leader James Frickleton and Alexander Doran and Theodore Seaman. Lakeshore's class, Leith Church, class leader Francis Lipset. Hoth's class leader Robert Hoth. Massey's class leader James Hewitt. Local pre-church history. Our pre-church history began in 1833, when the first two townships were surveyed for settlement. The following 30 years was a time of transformation. The Queensbush wilderness became a human habitat, brought about by the blood, sweat, and tears of our ancestors. They removed the trees, stumps, stones, which were cleared by hand, oxen, and by horses. They built shelters, cabins, then barns, and crossroad communities sprang up. The hardships encountered were daunting, to say the least. Most of these pioneers came to this land of opportunity to own land and to build better futures for themselves and their descendants. There was no turning back. Faith in themselves, their God, and their neighbors with hope eternal spurred them on. This 30-plus year period is a most interesting and inspiring time. One of the most important components of pioneer life was their freedom to worship. From the beginning of settlement, circuit riders, the saddlebag ministers, tirelessly circulated throughout the settled area, providing spiritual support, religious instruction, and performed marriages, baptisms, and burials. They organized mission classes and found class leaders who often led in worship. This was the pre-church period. A complete documentation of these years would take many volumes to record. We try to provide a condensed account of what took place. An occasional missionary has passed through the area, visiting a few natives prior to settlement. Other denominations. John Strawn was born April 12, 1778, in Aberdeen, Scotland, emigrating to Canada in 1799 to Kingston, Ontario. Ordained by Bishop Jacob Mountain, the Church of England, in 1803, he then moved to Toronto in 1812. Strawn disliked the United States, preferring a country or colony ruled by the Anglican elite. He became a pillar of the family compact. Strawn served on Executive Council of Upper Canada, 1817 to 1836, as well as the Legislature Council, 1814 to 1820. In 1835, he became the first Anglican bishop of the Diocese of Toronto. He supported the Constitutional Act, 1791, that set aside clergy reserves for support of Protestant clergy. Strawn argued that funds should be used exclusively for the support of Anglican clergy, even though many Presbyterians belonged to a church which was the established Church of Scotland. Strawn was even more critical of the Methodist Church in Canada. Their association with the American-based Methodist Episcopal Church angered him. He considered the American Methodists to be disloyal to Britain, even though many of them fought with the British during the war 1812 to 1814. He worked for the Anglican control of the education system. The 1837 rebellion resulted in change to Britain's colonial policy. As a political power, Strawn was reduced. His religious stature increased. Of local interest, on August 25, 1845, Strawn, with the traveling minister James Mockridge, paid a visit to Owen Sound to conduct a service in a schoolroom. However, he wasn't too impressed with the response he received. It wasn't until 1849 he appointed Irish-born Arthur Hill Ringland Mulholland to the field. Mulholland arrived at the village dock near midnight with his wife and 2 children on October 8, 1849. No one was there to meet them. However, Mulholland was not dissuaded. Indeed, he was to serve Owen Sound's congregation and surrounding area for over 40 years. Strawn passed away November 1st, 1867. Mulholland organized and oversaw most of the Anglican congregations that were consequently formed in the North Grey. He too was a saddlebag minister, albeit 8 years after Reverend John Neilands. There were many different denominations in North Grey. There were at least 2 Quaker settlements. One was in the Woodford area, where a small cemetery remains as a monument to those pioneers. The other Quaker settlement, known as the Friends, was near Williamstown, which was later named Heathcote. In Sullivan Township, Lutheran congregations were formed as the German settlers moved in. The Presbyterians and Baptists were almost as early as the Methodists. Please note that there were 4 different branches of the Methodists at one time, and there were also 4 different branches of Presbyterians. An early minister wrote to the head of the church explaining that it was quite difficult to form a congregation with so many competing denominations. They were all Christians. Reverend John Neilands brought more than a religious message to this area. His son William and wife Sarah, Aunt Sally, were relocated with their family to Derby Township by 1843. They were very active in church and community. Aunt Sally drove their team and wagon to Churchville in 1846 to raise money, mortgaged their property, thus assuring the completion of the first church in Owen Sound. It was situated where Central Place is now located on 3rd Avenue East today. William helped survey the road west from Rockford and is said to have held a prayer meeting after work each day. He was a Derby Township councillor. Most of their sons remained in the area. One son, John, became a minister and was associated with the Methodist Church in Chatsworth for a time. Joseph Neilands also settled in Derby. Indeed, early maps of Derby show considerable land owned by the Neilands family members. Reverend John brought several other Neilands to the area. His daughter married Luke Gardner. They lived at Inverhuron and are interred in Tara Cemetery. A half-brother of Reverend John's, David Neilands, took up land in St. Vincent. David's son farmed at Woodford, where Dennis Lynn and family now reside. That son was Robert Neilands. He too was active in both community and church. Reverend John's brother Daniel emigrated from Ireland to Peel County, where his large family was raised. Robert Neilands settled in Bruce County. One of the Neilands purchased 1,000 acres of land in Bruce County in early years of settlement. Of particular interest to us was Reverend John Nealon's nephew, Andrew Nealons, who settled in Holland Township at Massey on Lot 3, Concession 6, about 1854-55. This family played a key role in church and community. The present church was built on the original Nealons farm. Edward Nealons now resides on the Nealons homestead. We should mention the William Nealons home on the bypass just east of Grey Roots, on the south side of the road, built in 1869 for William and Sarah. It is now owned by Barry Moore, who plans to do more restoration of it. The first plowing match was held on that farm. We find members of those pioneer Nealons families in cemeteries throughout Grey and Bruce counties. Greenwood in Owen Sound is the resting place for Reverend John Nealons, 1779 to 1864. This man and his family were builders of homes, churches, and communities throughout this Queensbush area. It is not our intent to rewrite history. Perhaps we can, however, recognize the important role some of these dedicated pioneers played in the transformation of this Queensbush wilderness to this wonderful human habitat in which we are privileged to live. Reverend Nealons was the first minister assigned to Sydenham, Owen Sound, after the town lots were surveyed. He performed the first marriage in St. Vincent, the first marriage in Derby, the first marriage in Sydenham Township, the first marriage, I believe, in Sydenham, Owen Sound. He organized and was the first minister of the first congregation in St. Vincent, Mount Pleasant. He was responsible for most of the early mission classes and their class leaders. We read in the book, Broken Shackles, that when the former U.S. slaves finally arrived in Owen Sound, then called Sydenham, Reverend John Nealons found accommodations for them. He died in 1864, is interred in Greenwood Cemetery, Owen Sound, but to this date, his gravestone has not been included in the walking tour. Locally, an associate of Reverend John Nealons, Henry Smith, rests in the Methodist Cemetery here in Walters Falls. Few people are aware of the very important role he played in the development of this community. Henry and his brother Bernard Smith acquired land about 1884 in St. Vincent Township, lots 4 and 5, concession 12. They came from the Smith Falls area. In 1846, John Walter from the Smith Falls area walked the 400 miles to St. Vincent Township looking for a mill site. He thought he found one about 2 miles southeast of Henry Smith's farm. We will return to John Walter shortly. When Walter acquired land in Holland Township in 1852, he had a village plan drawn up, and settlers began to move in. One of the first was Henry Smith, who purchased several lots and built a home on the corner of Church Street and Alma Street about 1854. In 1857, he built a home for his daughter Susanna when she married the first blacksmith to arrive, James Dellery, in 1857. This was built on a lot of Henry's on Victoria Street. Today, this same structure is home to the Carefoot family. In 1864, Henry built the first Methodist church here on a lot he owned beside his Alma Street home. This church served both the Methodists and Anglicans for 16 years until the new stone church, St. Philip's, was built for the Anglican congregation in 1880. The same year, 1880, the brick Methodist church was built on Victoria Street. That first Methodist church on Alma Street stands today as a private residence. Henry's talents were indispensable to this early community. He was a framer, a very good carpenter. He kept store at his farm in 1840s. He kept bees and was a Methodist class leader and lay minister for about 20 years. We would call him a developer today. Quite an important pioneer he proved to be. Little acknowledgement is given for his many contributions. The importance of John Walter and his family seldom is acknowledged. Arriving in Euphrasia Township in 1848, they proceeded to build a home and mill site. The 1851 census shows his mill on Lot 30, Concession 10, to be the first mill site in Euphrasia Township. When Holland Township was opened for settlement, 1852, for that east part of Holland, John Walter acquired 292 acres of land, Lot 2, Concession 12. The Euphrasia mill lacked a reliable year-round water supply. In total, within a 10-year period, John Walter and family erected 4 mills. Some were rather primitive, but all functioned and made a great contribution to the community. The Anglican prayer meetings were held in the Walters' home until the Methodist Church was built in 1864. We could mention several others, but you get the picture, I am certain. Church construction dates and a record of the ministers who have served those congregations are very well covered. We will not bore you with those details. Dr. Cowell's 1972 account is a good reference. More recently, Churches of the North Grey Presbytery, edited by Janet Iles, adds to the church history. Churches became part of every crossroad community by the end of the 19th century, at which time the population had peaked. The early years of the 20th century saw the migration of that generation to the USA, Western Canada, and British Columbia. After World War II, the rural agricultural community became quite mechanized. Road systems greatly improved, and the urbanization of rural Ontario began. In the 1960s, church closures were the order of the day as population decline became evident. For example, about 1972, Euphrasia Township population was 55% of the 1900 population. Central schools followed the church closures. Today we witness the evidence that the only constants in life seem to be change and taxes. Change may not always be pleasing to us. In summation, churches seem to have gone full circle. Early congregations were mission supported. Today, some are again mission supported, while others close. But on the positive side, we see new community churches being built and new denominations being formed. We close our presentation in hopes that you have learned more about these pre-church times. Thank you for your interest and attention. Norman E. Seabrook.